So welcome everyone. Welcome to the NXP Campus Connect program. For this session, we'll be covering analog validation, and the presenters are myself, Abhijan Chakravarty, and Mayank Bansal, who is my colleague here at NXP. So. Um, First, a brief introduction. So, although Akhil had introduced us, so I'm a senior principal here at NXP. I'm in the analog validation team, and I've been working for about 15 years now on breakthrough analog automotive products. And my colleague here, Mayank Bansal, he's a senior validation manager. His overall experience is about 20 years, and he's been driving all the high-speed validation methodologies in our team at NXP. So let me jump directly into the agenda here. So I'll start off with a brief overview as to where analog validation fits into the semiconductor device lifecycle. Um, what is the mission or objective of analog validation function? What kind of coverage analog validation provides? Um, be, Infrastructure, be it the software or the hardware. And then I'll also dive into the planning stage, where I'll cover the methodology development, analog validation board development, planning, DUT code, and the automation. And Mayank will cover the execution phase, which is the board bring up, silicon bring up, the PVT validation, uh, the validation reports, what kind of value add we provide for our NPIs, followed by a brief summary of the skill set that is required for this function. So, firstly, I would like to talk a little bit about the target kind of markets that our products target. So we have four major verticals that we target and this is what we validate here. So it's the automotive, and this is a very critical a vertical because the requirements are very stringent here. Then we have the industrial and IoT, the mobile market, and the comms infrastructure market. So uh, and the analog validation team validates the products from all these verticals here. So let me start off with the semiconductor device life cycle. So this is a general overview of the device lifecycle. Many of you may already know this, but still I'll just give you uh, an introduction about this cycle so that you understand where the validation phase fits in. So in the very first stage, whenever a product needs to be developed, it starts from the first thing is the concept. We Basically the company, the NXP, needs to know what kind of products we have to build for to target the customer market and the requirement. So this is where we collect the customer inputs. We have a build an architecture around it and see if we are it's a feasible solution and profitable solution for us, um, so that we can go ahead with the product development. So following the concept, we have what is called the specification phase. This is critical for the design team, so that the product is built to a specification. Will The specifications finally need to be published to the customer as well in the form of a customer data sheet. But the design needs this to the build the IPs, integrate the modules, and so on. So this is where the specifications are documented. This is then provided to the design team. Design is a very vast field. It has many functions, be it a verification, front end, back end, DFT, and so on. There are quite a few functions there, and this is where the product development starts. And all the modules are build based on the specifications that's provided. So once the design is done, there is an event called a milestone called as a tape out, which is where the design goes into a fabrication facility. And the physical silicon comes out of the fabrication facility either firstly as a wafer, and then it is packaged into the required packages. So this is where analog validation, validation teams come in. The validation function is broadly divided into uh, two, which is the digital and analog validation. I'll go into depth in the next forthcoming slide. But this is where, in a sense, the product that is built is thoroughly validated to check if it meets all the functional requirements and the data sheet requirements that the designer is built upon. Okay, so this is kind of the last stage wherein uh, you can consider it as a last phase of defense for uh, wherein all the bugs need to be captured and fixed before it goes into product manufacturing. So once we have a clean design, uh, manufacturable design, it goes into product manufacturing. This is where this is the uh, manufacturing phase, basically volume manufacturing, and it has variable lot of stages, including product qualification and also yield analysis. Um, and then we have quality checks, which keeps the reputation of our company NXP, and then finally the product launch. So this is a very long cycle, but each block has its own phase, and this is where the validation comes in right before manufacturing. And we are the gatekeepers of the design, and the goal is to allow um, uh, no bugs to escape to the customer. Okay, so this is where analog validation comes in. Now, validation is the post-silicon validation is broadly classified into three major areas. The functional validation, whose role is to check the functional robustness of the design, the configurability, and the uh, functional modes of the device that is built. Then the analog validation is where we come in. This is and the objective here is to make sure that the part is electrically robust, even in harsh environmental conditions, and that is why thorough analog validation is required. And the third phase is ET characterization. This is um, also kind of characterization role, but it is done on volume samples. They have a different focus area, which is manufacturability, yield analysis, reliability qualification, and so on. So the three post-silicon functions have its unique focus areas, and analog validation is a critical function to ensure that the customer, uh, whatever the specs are given in the data sheet of the product, is what the customer sees, and there is no deviation there whatsoever. So I've talked about the semiconductor device life cycle, where analog validation fits in, and now I'll be diving deeper into the forthcoming slides, starting with the mission or objective of analog validation. So on the right, how do we select parts from the market, silicon or any ICs from the market? The first thing is we have a certain spec in our mind. We know the use case where it needs to fit into. Based on that, there are, let's say, for example, I don't know, like 10 or 20 products that are shortlisted. And then after that, I have to filter them out and see what specs are really critical for my application, and then shortlisted. And so this is all done with reference to a product data sheet. And the data sheet has this electrical specifications of all the modules in the design. So in the snippet here, I picked it up from the revolutionary gateway product for NXP. Um, and this is a snippet of the SAR-ADC specifications. Uh, Typical specs of a SAR-ADC include the gain error, the differential nonlinearity, the integral nonlinearity, and total unadjusted error. So these are different specs, which someone who is interested in using the SAR-ADC will check typically. Now, with this, how do we relate this to analog validation? So the role of analog validation is to ensure that all these specs that are published in the customer documentation, in this case the data sheet, is met and there are no deviations. And not just the data sheet here, but there are several electrical interfaces which have standards, global standards, for example, the JEDEC standards. And it's the validation team that checks that all the five standards are met. So apart from the electrical specs in the data sheet, all the standards also compliance standards also need to be met. So that's the top goal. Then of course we cannot keep validating it at our own pace. There is of course the time to market, which is important for the for placing the product in the market at the right time. Um, so it's not just quality. It is we have to do a quality job in a given time constraint. Um, and then of course the key thing is that there should be no deviations or customer issues that leak through beyond validation. So we are the gatekeepers of the design here. So yeah, that's the mission objective of analog validation. Now I dive into the coverage, what kind of coverage this function provides. So on the right, I have a picture of a typical a block diagram of a typical microcontroller. Again, this is with reference to the S32G2 product. So there are a lot of modules here, which is integrated tightly, and a few of them are memory modules, digital modules, analog modules. Of course, everything in this world is, if you think about it, is analog. So the analog has to be converted to digital, and the post processing is done. So all the key interfaces are analog. So so for example, if there is a memory, which is let's say DDR, so it will have a physical interface. When I say physical interface, or if you know, the physical layer is basically which implements the electrical functionality of the interface, voltage swings and timings and so on. So this is where the PHY interface comes in. And similarly, you have other interfaces like the clocking and the SAR ADCs and the PCI Express interface, again the PHY and the gigabit Ethernet. So all these are there. You will see quite a lot of analog for uh, every microcontroller that goes there out there. So some of the key typical subsystems, analog subsystem that we cover in analog validation include power management, clock sources, typically PALL, crystal oscillators, the RC oscillators, etc. Data converters like the SAR ADC, sigma deltas, and so on. High-speed interfaces like the DDRs, the PCI Express, the Ethernets, and so on. The pads can be single-ended differential, all like the GPIO pads, the FlexRay, and so on. And apart from these are just modules, right? And then there, how these modules integrate into the SoC. Let's say I'm using the PCI Express interface in at a particular data rate, and what's the interaction of it with the subsystem. And yeah, these are just to a select few, just to give you an idea about how what kind of subsystems we cover, and the list goes on and on. It's a very long list. I cannot simply put it in on a slide here. Yeah, so these are the subsystems we cover, and um, the coverage is not just about the blocks. It's about what kind of environmental factors we validated across, and these include the process variations, typically those introduced by the fabrication process, the voltage variations, the min, max, and the typical voltages that is mentioned in the data sheet, the temperature variations. Let's say I have an IC which is sitting, in the frozen condition there, but I still expect that to work. And similarly, there's an IC which is at a very hot condition, maybe you know probably sitting in a car in a desert. You never know. So those kind of harsh temperature conditions. So we have to ensure that the robustness that this product provides from NXP has to meet all the is robust across all these variations, be it the process, voltage, temperature, and the frequency. Of course, the frequency can be the limits of the clocks, or whatever is the use case. Okay, so this is a brief introduction about the coverage. Okay, so now I know what are the modules or subsystems that I would like to cover in analog validation. Also, I know that it is done across PVT conditions. But now what I really need is, do I have the right infrastructure to validate these breakthrough kind of designs? Okay, I just have a few pictures of the typical high-end equipment that is used in validation. Be it the power supplies, the high bandwidth oscilloscopes, the BERT scopes. This is a bit error rate tester, the function generators, and so on. Or maybe it is the thermal equipment which provides the right kind of temperature conditions. On the left, we have a picture of a typical analog validation setup, the board, the cabling, and the high-speed connectors, high bandwidth oscilloscopes, and the pattern generators, and so on. So this is like a whole system which helps us, and the icing on the cake is that all of this has to be automated, so that you don't have to sit for hours together for the data to be collected. So yeah, so this is how the lab infrastructure is supposed to be, ideally, so that the validation function can analog validation can run smoothly. Um, Next, I would like to start with the planning, and so I just gave you an introduction about the role itself, but now I'll dive deeper into the two main sections of analog validation, the planning and execution. I'll of course cover the planning here. So 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 what is analog validation planning? So I have a design. The design has several modules in it. I have to understand what kind of analog modules. Firstly, I have to shortlist all the analog modules that I need to validate against. The type of specs that are in the data sheet that is published to the customer, the type of standards that are available globally, be it JEDEC spec and so on. So there are some talking about the um, standards. I've just highlighted a few of those standards which we validate. And again, this is just a few, like the USB, the PCI Express, the DDR, the MIPI camera serial interface, and so on. Okay, so let's say I have a new module which is there, which I don't have the capability. So here, what is done is there needs to be a robust methodology developed for analog validation, and for that I need to understand basically the electrical parameters. I need to thoroughly understand the standards that is provided. And these standards are the same standards that the customer would develop his system uh, uh, that is used for developing the customer subsystem. So basically, what I want is that I should understand the parameters and the standards. Uh, so once I've understood that, next I explore the available commercial solutions. There are a lot of tool vendors out there. I'll just throw a random few names there, like the Keysight, the Tektronix, Rohde and Schwarz, LaCroix. So those are all the tool vendors which provide solutions, and these tool vendors they just give it to you as a package. So it is the ownership of the analog validation team to evaluate those packages to see if those packages are good enough for a robust kind of validation for the NXP products or not. So it's the firstly identify the capabilities of the solution, and then the you have to evaluate those solutions as well in-house. So if so sometimes there are commercial solutions, sometimes we need to build some solutions in-house, for which we may not have those commercial solutions available. And this is a really challenging task, because and it takes quite significant investigation, um, so that we again what is critical to us is that the methodology that we develop targets all the electrical specs that are in the data sheet. So for solutions that are not available, we develop our own in-house methodology. And even in case if the solution is available, that they are not tuned to match our existing framework in the lab. So there are few customizations and so on. So all that comes in the methodology development. So once the methodology is identified, the next step would be to manually validate each of those parameters. Um, what I mean is, I just pick up a few parameters, for example, the timing parameters. Let's say, for example, the setup hold times of some interface. Uh, I would use the solution that I have just created, and manually validate each of the parameters. So this is like a proof check. Is the solution doing the thing that is it measuring it the right way? Is it measuring it as per the standard? Is it measuring with the right resolution, the timing scale, and so on? So all these needs to be uh, further refined in the manual validation phase. And this is where all the details of each test for each parameter is identified. So once that is done, um, now comes the next goal of the validation setup, which is to make it a fully automated setup. So we keep stressing on the automation of these methodologies, because it makes your life simpler. That's the simplest way to say it. It makes your life simpler. You don't have to be sitting in front of your setups and recording those measurements. So I have a picture here of a typical probing solution. In this case, this is like the DDR probing solution, and you will see that the 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 instruments or the solution that I have identified, it's not just typing those test points and measuring it. I have to make sure that they do not alter the behavior of the analog signal. If there are losses in the setup, it actually ruins my measurement. So I have to take care that it is a solution which is non-intrusive, meaning it doesn't degrade the quality of the signals. So this is all about the methodology development phase. And I'll move further to the board development. So this is the next phase of planning. You have identified a setup. Now, once the silicon comes, you need to have a board. Again, the same conditions for the board apply. it's the same as the test setup. Even in this case, like I have mentioned here a few criteria for analog validation board development, and the first and the most critical one is the signal integrity. And the board has to be designed in such a way that there is absolutely no loss or degradation in the analog signal. The signal can be a weak signal that I need to measure. The impedances, the terminations, the bandwidth of the signal, and so on. These are very critical for me to do a very pristine type of a measurement. So apart from the signal integrity, again, then I would make sure that the board, all the connectors on the board are low, have extremely low loss. I do not want the signal to be degraded, because then I won't be measuring the actual signal. Okay, so the board analog validation board typically has these kind of low loss connectors. Uh, as I mentioned earlier, these the validation analog validation is done across PVT, and so which includes a thermal sweep also. So the board has to it has to have a keep out area, so that I don't I effectively heat up the or cool down the DUT to the right temperature. It can be, let's say, the cold can go up to -40, the hot for auto products it goes to 150 and so on. So the board has to be able to sustain that kind of temperature variations. So that means it has to be carefully designed. Now the silicon is there. Now I need a how do I place this? Because I need to run it across several parts, right? So there I need a high performance socket again. Similar to a low loss connector, the socket also has to be a low loss or a high performance kind of socket, high bandwidth sockets, and so the parasitics of all these connectors need to be carefully investigated. The capacitances, the inductances, and so on. And we make sure with the we follow up with the socket vendors about these electrical properties. It's not just the mechanical properties; it's also the electrical properties, which is needs to be carefully attended to. And then a good board is one which is observable and controllable. So um, let's say I have a critical, I see some deviation in an electrical measurement, and for that I have to start debugging that, and the best way to do is do it blockwise and or stepwise, and then so at every step we need to have some connector so that we know what's the quality of the signal at the end of each phase or each block connector and so on. So observability is really critical there, and controllability. Now, since I said the it's all an automated setup, so every part of this board has to be automated, be it the the JTAG interfaces through the debugger. There are a few selections here, which can be a mux selection and so on. So all those kind of switches need to be controlled through automation. So controllability is really critical there. So I move on to the next slide here, which talks about the planning. So I talked about the methodology development and the board development. Now in this planning phase, this is where we identify what kind of coverage uh, I have to provide for that module. Um, what kind of, so on the left, I have a list of things that the analog validation plan typically covers. It covers the test configuration. This is how you put the part in the right configuration to make those electrical measurements. I have a brief summary about the test setup and the kind of uh, the board, the flavor of the sample that is used. Let's say I have a oscilloscope, what kind of bandwidth, what kind of probes I have used, any firmware revisions of the tool, compliance tools, and so on. So that is all written down in detail in the analog validation plan. Then we have the procedure, which is like the heart of the plan here. So once I have the configuration, I have the setup. Uh, the analog valuation plan outlines the. It's not just the outline; it's actually a very detailed uh, uh, algo or the step-by-step procedure of how the electrical measurements are made, and um, also the plan outlines the PVT conditions, the process voltage temperature conditions that are targeted for this type of testing. And each analog module is actually embedded in its subsystem. So subsystem level testing is kind of the worst case testing that you can say. Uh, if I do a standalone testing, the results may come out good. But if I now use the whole subsystem, let's say I have the ADC which is triggered from some other unit. I have the DMA and so on. So the whole subsystem is now in picture, and this may affect the electrical performance of that module. So this is where and this is how the customer would also um, uh, run the module. So in the application board. So these subsystem level test case actually makes a lot of sense there. It's not just that I've done a standalone validation, subsystem level validation, but I also need to know how robust my design is. Do I have a good enough margin, or is it just marginal? Is there a chance of failure on field? So those kind of tests are covered through marginality tests. Now, an analog validation plan has several inputs. Firstly, we have the design documentation. This design guide is basically, it tells you what kind of features the module supports, what is the configuration, what kind of specs that the module is developed to. And then you have the customer documentation, the data sheet, uh, all the specs. The, Whoever is doing or developing the analog validation plan goes through the data sheet line by line, including the notes, footnotes, test conditions, everything, and the data sheet. So whatever is there in the data sheet, we are legally bound to adhere to that as a company, and this is why we are selling parts commercially. So the data sheet is a very critical input for the analog validation plan. The reference manual is a document which provides information to the user about how to configure the module in the right manner. Uh, so the data sheet is basically the electrical spec. The reference manual is basically a configuration kind of document which tells you how to configure the part. If you configure it in the wrong way, of course, the specs may not meet, or you can have spec violations and so on. So this is a document which tells you how to configure the part, and these are available to the customers, by the way. Then there is another input to the analog validation plan, which is the previous learnings. And this is an ongoing kind of a thing wherein if there are any learnings from, let's say, from some use case that the customer uses, we would like to really test against those, because those are the most impactful ones. So the learnings is a constant process, and all these inputs keep going into the
ನಿಮ್ಗೂ
analog.
ವಯಸ್ಸು ಬರ್ರಿ ನೀವು.
Okay. All right. So next we move on to the DUT code and automation. So as I've been stressing, uh, the automation is a very critical phase, or it's a component of the analog validation scheme. But there is something called the DUT code, and as I was talking about the reference manual, which tells you how to configure the part, uh, the we have to have some kind of a code which is meant to configure the module, meant for the module configuration, um, and this is in alignment with the reference module. reference manual. Then we have no, we cannot. So there are some basic guidelines for DUT coding, and the device under test. Uh, it can be the programming language can be anything like typically it can be embedded C or there can be so many other languages there. And so but there what is critical is that we develop the code in a good fashion. So we generally use the API based coding structure, which basically divides the whole DUT code into chunks, and which has its own programming interface. It promotes the reusability of the code, the portability of the code, and also the fragmentation of the code. And so yes, so that is about the API based coding. And also the code, it needs to handshake with the automation framework. So there has to be some hooks for automating that. Uh, so uh, so automation can be through the JTAG debugger and so on. Now, next thing is about the automation of the test setup. So I just showed you some pictures of some of the common lab equipment. Now, all those have to be integrated and controlled using automation. So the typical programming languages that we use are the National Instruments LabVIEW, the National Instruments Test and Python. We know all know it's an open source coding code there. And so this is what we typically use and to make sure that there is total controllability of the equipment, and not just the equipment, it's the test hardware. The test hardware can be the components of the board. It can be the JTAG debuggers and so on. So every piece of the test setup needs to be essentially controllable through automation. So yeah, that's about the DUT code and automation. And I would like to now transfer it over to Mayank, who will lead us through the next part of the presentation.
So I'm sharing the screen. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Abhijan, for taking us through the validation flow and planning. So I'm Mayank Bansal, and I will be covering the overview of execution procedures in analog validation activity. You can expect to get glimpse of various post-silicon validation approaches and its systematic techniques. So for today's discussion, to make it simple, we have broadly categorized this execution activity into five key steps. First, the board bring up, then second, the silicon bring up, third, PBT validation, validation report, followed by the debug. So let's look more closely each of its category. So first we have the first element of the execution is the board bring up. So printed circuit board, or simply called the boards, they are designed specifically for the purpose of post-silicon analog validation activity. And as a part of the board bring up activity, it needs to be checked for power, clock, resets, controls, and so on. So before a SoC or the system on chip can be placed on it. So key items during the board bring up that we need to take care is first the visual inspection and the shots. So even before you switch on the board, even if power on the board, first make sure to check the visually. Look out for any loosely soldered parts or any wrong orientation of key components such as a processor, it can be memory, or it can be any other important components of your board. So once you are through with the visual inspection, then we need to check for shots, any kind of shot or open. They can be unexpected shot open on your board. So you can use handheld multimeter to check for all these shots and opens. Now we are through visual inspection and we are through the open short check. Next, we can power on the board. So once the main power is switched on, we need to check immediately for any overheating effect in any part of the board. Verify that regulators voltage levels to ensure that they are operating at the prescribed output range. And once power is checked, we need to check the clocks, the reference or the system clock, which is given to the SOC, that needs to be checked on the scope, or scope in the oscilloscope, where you can make sure that they are in accordance with the design for various parameters such as frequency, amplitude, jitter, and so on. So far we have understood visual inspection and shots, we have understood power and clock checks. Then the third thing, at times, we also do some S parameter measurements or also known as scattering parameters. So these are the complex metrics that show reflections and transmission characteristics in frequency domain. So lab instruments such as VNA, TDR, they can be used to measure the S parameter models. And for this S parameter model, we can be of for any board, it can be of any cable, connector, or combine of all those things. We can do S parameter measurement for package also. So these models are then imported to the instrument like oscilloscope, where we utilize these models for de-embedding. And de-embedding is nothing but we remove the effect of the board losses when we do the high-speed interfaces. And these S parameter model can also be used for any kind of simulation analysis or correlation activity with the actual system. Okay, then the fourth, there are some switch or jumper settings also that are available on the board, and they have the provision to change modes and configurations on the board. We need to ensure that these deep switcher settings are at the desired states or settings for bringing up new board. So this sums up the broad idea and categories that are required for a board bringer. Then second element of our execution activity is silicon bring-up. So in the silicon bring-up, basically silicon bring-up means it involves powering of the new SoC and check for its basic functionalities. So there are certain critical steps that decides the status of new silicon. So when I say associate or silicon, you can say that they mean the same almost for my presentation. So there are certain critical steps that decide the status of new silicon. Let's understand some of them. So first is power on reset behavior check. Power on reset or POR ensure that system power supply stabilizes at the correct levels. The clock of the processor settles accurately and the loading of the internal registers is complete before the device actually starts working. So we just discussed about board bring up in the previous slide. There I talked about the power rails coming up at the normal levels. And if they come in the desired sequence order, then system power good is generated. And which in turn enables the power on reset circuitry for SOC. So that's first item that we need to take care during the silicon bring up, the power on reset. Then the second thing is voltage and current on the supply rails. So when we power on silicon, the immediate thing that we need to do is to monitor the power supply levels and current which is getting drawn on the power lines. You may observe some kind of abnormalities while drawing this current. So we need to make sure that voltage and currents are in accordance with what has been designed and what is expected at the input of the silicon. There may be possibility that you may observe some kind of heating on your silicon or any nearby component. If any such discrepancy is found, you need to immediately turn off the SoC and go for recheck of all kind of shorts and configurations on your board. It can be your board or it can be your SoC. So once we are through the power and current supply rails, then clock verification. So there are many SoCs where they need some kind of reference clock or system clock as an input. So when external clock is fed to the device or SoC, the internal PLL must be logged. When I say internal PLL, it is for the SoC. the internal PLL of the SoC must be locked for its suitable operation. So it is important to verify the PLL lock status during the initial bring up. And if we do not see PLL is getting locked, then we need to check the quality of the input reference clock or ensure the registers are configured in proper fashion. So now, so far we have looked into the power on reset, we have looked into the power and currents clock. The another important activity is the debugger communication. So a debugger is an essential device, I would say, that allow user to communicate with SoC through some kind of port. This port can be a JTAG port or it can be any standard debug connector on your board. The other end of this debugger will be having USB or Ethernet. So one such example we can have is code wire tab, which we use as for debugger communication. So as a part of successful silicon bring up on the bench, an engineer must be able to read and write the registers through these debugger. Through this debugger, we can configure the internal registers of device. We can load tests in its internal memory. So this is very crucial activity for a part of bring up. Low-level scripting such as Tickle or high-level scripting such as Python, they all can be used to communicate through this debugger. So next is basic check of all modules in design. So it is imperative that early silicon sample must pass through a varied set of tests to see that silicon is rock solid and its all major modules are functioning. So all the critical modules of SoC that we identify, they must be tested at room temperature during the initial bring up for basic functionalities. Then only we can say our SoC has brought up well. So if I summarize this slide, so in short, I would say the criteria for a successful bring up is that it should come out of the reset. A user should be able to communicate, read and write with your SoC. PLL must be locked if there's any requirement. All the critical modules of your chip should be tested for basic functionalities. So this sums up slide number 2. I mean, I would say the second element of the execution, the silicon bring up. So once we are through all the basic checks of silicon bring up and board bring up, the third element is PVT validation. So PVT validation is a more focus shifted towards comprehensive bench level validation or characterization. It is, I would say it is an extensive validation that requires collecting the data across varied environmental conditions. These environmental conditions can be process, voltage, or temperature, even the frequency. So that is why we call it as PVT validation or PVT characterization. In the PVT validation, this involves configuring the DUT for different use case, different modes, different configurations, and then we capture the results and validate the silicon performance under different conditions of voltage, temperature, and frequency. And this actually needs to, this entire set of activity needs to be repeated on different process. And this different process when we run, this is called process corners. So when I say different process, the process corners can be slow or SS, fast FF, typical TT, or slow fast and fast slow. There can be many more process corners where we have to work. So once we are through exhaustive validation, then there is another kind of test that we need to know is compliance testing. So in the compliance testing, it is a process of selecting each, I would say, each requirement in a protocol standard document and then validating it to ensure that if design modules or device is meeting the requirements or not. In our bench validation, we do pre-compliance testing to ensure that device is ready to pass the final product certification testing. So different lab instruments, vendors, they provide us the compliance suite or software application which can be used as a tool to validate the compliance of the desired protocol that you are validating. Another aspect of PVT validation is subsystem level test. So these are special tests where we explore the effect of various subsystems of SoC on the analog modules, such as clock, power, and other signal integrity artifacts. So it's an advanced level of testing where we are trying to run all the adjacent and high switching modules for maximum transaction so that we can study the impact of on analog modules which is under test. I would say if you want to see the impact of noise, crosstalk, coupling, so all this you can see once you do the subsystem level testing. And this actually can impact the performance degradation. This can add noise or jitter in your system, or it can even impact specification failure of your analog module. The main purpose of this test is to ensure that there is a zero escape of bug before the silicon reaches to the customer. Logging, design, and documentation issue and root cause analysis. Okay, so here there's an enormous amount of time and effort that goes into the properly characterizing and understand the performance of these critical interfaces. And so we must inspect and thoroughly analyze the measurement data that we are collecting from all these sweeps. And if any outliers or any out of range measurements or any kind of failures that we are reporting, we need to identify their root cause and we must correct them. So this is also a part of PVT validation. So if you look at the diagram here, it just shows the different stages required in the validation. So we start with the baseline validation. So baseline is a term which is related to the typical process corner. So validation work carried out on the typical process parts is called baseline validation. So typical process parts we validate across VT condition. VT means voltage and temperature conditions. And the next stage is PVT validation, where we bring the process corners such as slow, and fast, and we validate them across VT conditions. Then third is a subsystem level test, which I already described. Here we created different conditions by enabling the other modules and see their impact on the interface that we are validating. In last, we have a debug or root cause analysis. So as I mentioned earlier, if failure is observed, then it is important to debug it and bring it to closure. We will cover this topic in more details in the coming slide under the heading of NPI value addition. So this sums up the third element of our execution activity. All right. So the fourth element is validation report. One of the area that people ignore, but is very, very key area. The analog validation report is an important deliverables at the end of PVT validation. The purpose of this report is to summarize and provide a concise overview of the entire validation efforts and the results that we are obtaining. The information present in this validation report should be in alignment with the validation plan defined earlier. I remember Abhijan talked about validation plan. So whatever validation plan is created, this report should be in alignment with that validation plan. The key stakeholders who are interested in these reports, they can be from design, they can be from application, can be customer, and many more. So now let's look at some of the important requirement that we see of a good validation report. Summary tables and plots. So informative tools such as tables, plots, and different graphs, actually they help us to summarize the results and findings. In fact, they can give us the insight into the trend of silicon performance across PVT. how the silicon is performing, how they are trending, where their degradation is coming, where they are improving. So all that trend can be seen in this PVT plots. Then next is parameter-wise PVT results. So the test report should also summarize the electrical validation test performed over various process, voltages, and temperatures, and each for each parameters with a pass and fail remark. So that will help us to understand which parameter has passed or which has failed. Then the third element of the report should be sorry, design tickets and the documentation tickets. So we discussed about the failures issue that we may see. So once this issue or the defect is noticed and confirmed during the validation activity, it can be filed as a ticket. And if it is a design issue or sorry, if it's a design issue or if it, then we assign it to the design owner. It's called design tickets. If the error is with reference to document, then it will be termed as documentation ticket. Design margin. So report should also have information related to pass or fail margin. So once we collect statistically significant number of validation data, it helps me to identify the margin the design or the IP has. Without knowing the margin in my design, this report is of no use for me. So make sure that report should have design margins also. In the right side, if you see a snippet is shown here, it's a snippet of a compliance report where a particular PCI protocol has been validated, and you can see the list of parameters that has been tested, some of the parameters showing with the tick mark and with the margin here. And these are some of the plots which have been captured during this compliance testing. So with this, we covered the fourth element of the execution activity. So moving on to the fifth element and the most important element for a validation and validation activity is value adding NPI. NPI is new product introduction. So errors that were not detected during the pre-silicon, they can appear in the first silicon. The primary objective of post-silicon validation is to capture those bugs. What do we do when validation results show failures, or how do we deal with it? So when the test case fails in the lab, the first step is to identify the cause of this failure. There can be numerous reasons for these failures. It includes, it can be test setup, it can be a documentation error, or it can be a silicon design issue. So we need to look each thoroughly and rule out what is not the issue. So if it is related to the test setup failure, let's say if it is a test setup failure, then it can be due to the tools that we use to enable the board setups, configure the boards. The boards board may itself go bad, instruments, samples, or the test cases. So at times, the tools used for validations, they may be faulty or may not be fully operational. The boards that we use, they might have some damaged components or they may have some inconsistent performance. The test instruments, the lab instruments such as scope, BERT, and all those instruments that we use in the lab, they might have gone bad or uncalibrated or not connected or even not configured in the correct manner. So that can also be an issue here. On many instances, SoC itself might have gone bad. It may be due to your poor handling or some kind of ESD damage. So the test cases. So test cases that we write to test the modules, to validate the modules, they may not be free from bugs. So all these factors actually leads to your setup related issues. And we need to ensure that the measurement, that failure that we are seeing is not related to the setup issue. So once we are through the, once if the setup is ruled out, then it could be a documentation issue or silicon issue also. Let's say register values or mapping or specification related information is not correctly documented in the datasheet or manual, then user may end up getting failures in their measurements. So this is more of a documentation error or documentation issue, and it needs to be fixed, and reference document has to be error free for the customer before it goes to the customer. Now, let's say we have ruled out documentation issue also. Now we have ruled out documentation issue also, and we have ruled out the setup issue also. So now the thorough examination needs to be done on the design side. The failure itself needs to be repeatable. If failure is not repeatable, if it is just one instant, then it is very difficult to identify the design issue also. So it has to be repeatable, and it has to be tested across the different conditions for several times. Conditions like process, voltage, temperature, frequency, and so on. So once a failure is confirmed as a sighting, we make it as a sighting, we call it sighting, and a debug team is assigned for its disposition. That means, as I mentioned earlier, we need to ensure we have to root cause and close this open item. So typically, this debug team will involve collaboration among validation representatives, even architecture, design, and test engineering. They will work closely to find the root cause of the failures and try to reproduce these failures in their respective environments. And if there's a software workaround, then errata can be published for the customer. But if there is no such workaround available, then it can be fixed only in the next revision of silicon. So with this, we complete the 5 aspects of analog validation execution that I mentioned earlier. So let me summarize. So we have walked through 5 key elements of analog validation cycle: board bring up, silicon bring up, PVT validation, validation report, and the debug activity. Then, okay, so post-silicon validation is an emerging research topic with several outstanding challenges, and it's a very interesting area. And you will be overwhelmed to see the amount of opportunities available for this exciting research and contribution in this particular field. The increasing complexity of hardware designs, shorter time to market, it all brings a lot of new challenges. So I would say a lot of opportunities are available here. So I would say that analog validation is like an art where an engineer should have a good creative thinking. He or she has to imagine all the possible cases the product will face in the application perspective. They should have the ability to hit all the corner cases for the products. If we specifically talk about the technical skill sets, so this slide refers to these key skill sets for analog validations. So first, they must possess strong semiconductor basics, which is going to help in deep diving and understanding the behavior of analog modules and provide edge in the debugging skills. A good knowledge of instrumentation and probing, it plays a very significant role in building the robust test setup and new methodology. Understanding of embedded C for DUT programming. It is a must kind of thing for developing the test cases that are required in validation. Knowledge of LabVIEW or Python, sorry, knowledge of LabVIEW or Python for automation. Actually, it is required to automate the whole test environment. As Abhijan mentioned earlier about the automation, so that means we're going to automate the voltage, temperature, frequency, lab instruments, and test cases. All this can be controlled using automation in the lab. And that for that, a user must be good in either LabVIEW or Python or similar language. Actually, this whole thing is going to help us in overall improving the productivity and efficiency of our work. Signal integrity basics and board level knowledge. It can be very instrumental in dealing with hardware challenges during the course of time, because you are going to see a lot of issues with board, maybe silicon or design. So the knowledge of signal integrity will be very helpful here. So with this, we have completed the NXP Campus Connect session on analog validation. Thank you for your time and attention. And now we are open for questions.